Hello, this is Mark Wildman of Wildman Athletica, and today we are going to talk about running athletic program design considerations. This is part of a larger series of videos where we are detailing the 10 fundamental actions of Herbertism. Herbertism has led to a bunch of different types of training throughout history, specifically obstacle coursing, military obstacle coursing, and like fun stuff like playground equipment. The playground equipment mostly went out in the 80s, but it was pretty awesome for about 100 years total. You'll see pictures from like the 1920s of like jungle gyms that were like 30 feet high before they were so concerned about litigation. Previously, we had talked about walking. In order to be better at walking, most people first need to get better at standing. That means Olympic lifting, kettlebell lifting, heavy club swinging, mace swinging, hydrocore, Bulgarian bag, a bunch of stuff like that that helps people accidentally work on their standing structure. After we do walking, we progress to running. The same fundamental idea is true. If we're better at standing, overall, we can be better at running in the beginning. So the core ideas that most people work on first are heavy club swinging, kettlebelling, cross-body stabilization, hydrocore, and Olympic lifting. But running is a huge topic because running is that thing that separates us from almost everything else on the planet. Humans do it a little bit different than everybody else. Humans are hairless and we can breathe out of time, so we can run other animals into the ground. You can read a lot about this idea in the book Born to Run, which details the concepts and the theories about persistence hunting. There are still some tribes in Africa that still persistence hunt. The idea of persistence hunting is that humans would chase after an animal in a group of some way to keep it corralled in a straight line, and the animal runs faster than them because most animals on the planet are faster than humans. And then the animal would stop to rest and humans would run up on it and it would take off again. And eventually it would no longer be able to cool its body down and it would essentially just lay down and die. And humans would run up, clock it with a rock, and drag it home. That requires a great distance of running. Humans run really far. So running is something that should be included in your program because it is a fundamental human skill. When we think about training running in the beginning, there are a lot of ways we can train it. Most people have treadmill running available to them, especially if they live like in a city. Big box gyms are stacked full of treadmills. The things that we think about with treadmills are time under tension or pace control programs. That is something that makes treadmills very fun, pace control and time under tension. You can control the exact speed down to the fraction of a kilometer or the fraction of a mile per hour that a treadmill can spin, and then you keep up with it. Treadmill running does not work for absolutely everybody, but it is an absolutely accessible idea for most people in the population. After that, we think about track. Track is the classic way that you think about training all the way back to ancient Greece and the Olympics. This is the kind of stuff that most people do when they're young, but they lose access to as they get older. Once they get beyond university age, track tends to disappear as a viable form of training for most people. Some CrossFit gyms do have track days and they do track work, but they don't do it in the same way that you would do in high school or college because most people simply don't have that much time to devote to track training. So the limiting factor in track training tends to be the amount of time it takes. Professional athletes who spend time doing track spend 4 hours a day doing it. I know a couple from Great Britain and their workouts are 4 hours long. That puts it outside of the range of possibility for most people, and then most people move towards something like treadmill running. The type of running that I like the most is something like trail running, running on natural surfaces. I like trail running because it's closer to what the human body and the human brain is designed to do. You are designed to do something like trail running or better, off-trail running, where you're picking a path through an unknown environment. Trail running is a known environment. You can run a little bit faster doing trail running because you're pretty sure that people have ran that way before, therefore you're pretty sure that it's safe. But you still have to look at the ground. Your brain has to calculate where to put your foot each time. Your step distance varies. Your breathing varies because the elevation varies, because the step distance varies. The way that your ankles, your hips, the arch of your foot, your knees all work when you're doing trail running is different than when you run, say, on track or on treadmill. Unlevel surfaces is really what the defining characteristic is of trail running. Off-trail running is probably my favorite type of trail running, but it's the hardest to program for because most people don't have access to a place where they can safely run off trail for distance. Off trail running means you're running off trail and you have to pick your path through an unknown environment. Different footstep, different elevation, different surfaces that you're running on, transitioning from hard surface to soft surface. Off trail running is the closest thing to persistence hunting, but it is the hardest for most people to have access to. When you think about all of these things, you would like to start by running with nothing in your hands, but eventually you would like to take each one of these ideas and put something in your hands. And we're gonna take that back to the idea of persistence hunting. People used to run in order to stay alive. People tend not to do that much anymore. But if you are trying to mimic more natural types of running, then you can introduce running with objects into each one of these categories. Treadmill, once again, is the easiest one to introduce because you can control the time under tension, the load, and the pace the most specifically. You can run with maces, you can run with med balls, you can run with a myriad of different objects. Most people in the natural world who are hunting would run with something in one hand and probably change their hand halfway through. So that is something that can be very, very highly controlled in treadmill. Usually the weights for that are very, very light. If you're thinking about people used to run with an Atlatl is a big dart thrower or a spear thrower. Think of a giant arrow that's maybe 5 to 6 feet long and a lever that helps you accelerate that thing. That is the thing in human history that came before the bow in most places. Places like Australia that didn't have many fruit-bearing trees, which were good for bow making, never got much beyond the Atlatl stage. So people would run with 2 or 3 darts and an Atlatl in one hand. As you progress throughout history, people would run with a bow in one hand or a spear in one hand. So we can talk more about the weights of those and how to mimic them over time. But the easiest way to mimic something like that would be to run with a light mace, 5, 7, 10 pounds. Running with a 15-pound mace is a big challenge for most people. That's a lot of load that you're stabilizing on one side of the body. So there's a bunch of things that we need to think about when we're doing that type of training. Beyond these 3 types of training, we get into some more entertaining types of training. Running over obstacles. That can be very much integrated into trail and specifically off trail running where you're picking your path, but obstacle course running is something that's become popular in the modern world and there's a bunch of different versions of it. Probably the most popular version in the Western world is Spartan running or Spartan races, and there's different companies that do different versions of that. That's an intermediate kind of long distance obstacle course race where the obstacles are fairly far in between. My favorite version of obstacle coursing is something like Parkour, which is moving over city environments and moving over and around the obstacles in the city environment. And there's a whole category of movements specifically in parkour which mimic Herbertism because that's exactly what parkour is based on. It is based on Herbertism. The defining characteristic of parkour is that it is chasing and escaping. The person who is running away is escaping. The person who is chasing is chasing. Free running, it takes this idea of obstacle coursing, but moves it out of the context of chasing and escaping and moves it into the context of style or flow. Moving easily, but they can add a lot of things like tricking into free running. So it's not the most efficient path as parkour would probably strive to be in chasing and escaping, but free running leaves room for style and flair as opposed to just pure escape and chase. Chase and escape also lines up with most sports that you play, specifically soccer. You are chasing a ball. If you have the ball, you are trying to escape to get to one side, and if you are defending, then you are chasing the person with the ball. You're chasing the ball or you're chasing a person. Chasing and escaping allows people to run very, very far very efficiently because it tricks them into thinking that they're not running as far. The great thing about this idea, something like soccer, is that you are not noticing and your pace is changing and your footwork is changing all the time, as opposed to something like treadmill, where you're essentially running in a straight line. Track, you're essentially running in a straight line, maybe going over something like hurdles. Trail and off trail, you're pacing yourself. With something like sport, could be rugby, could be soccer, also known as European football, could be lacrosse. You're always chasing and escaping. So all of these different types of programs have different considerations, but they all try to make you better at that basic human skill running. When you think about all of these things, think about originally doing it with no weight, then introduce weight or things that you hold into it. And then over time, you start to add things like armor. Something that happened in the original Olympics was people added in armored running because that is what people back then were most concerned with. So there were 100 meter and 400 meter sprints and probably longer sprints that I'm not aware of, where people would run in bronze armor with helmets and then weapons. And I believe that they started taking things out over time until we got back to track, which we have today, where we have taken all of the armor out of it. In the modern world, CrossFitters and military guys have started adding armor back into this, and you'll see a bunch of different versions of running with armor and objects in your hand coming back into vogue, becoming more popular now. So we can talk more about that type of thing because I think that's where running is going in the future, if that's what people want to talk about. And then how to use each one of these ideas to train for that idea. Running is a huge, huge, huge topic, and people devote their entire life to either coaching it or being very, very good at it. There's an upper distance on running, but I don't really know what it is. I know that there are now ultra long distance runs where people run for 200 to 250 miles. People can stack up huge amounts of running. In a modern context, for your average individual, what we are really looking for most people is running something like a 400 meter sprint or 400 meter sprint repeats. I think 400 meters is the most useful for your average person to work on. And people are gonna argue with me about that all day, and that's totally fine. We all have different reasons for why we do it. Running is such a huge topic that it's very hard to even think about it. This is just the basics of how I think about running training. Treadmill is the most accessible. Start with time under tension and pace control, then move to running with objects. Track tends to be out of the ability of most people to get to or program for. Most people just don't have access to things like track. Trail running is awesome, but once again, it's harder to deal with. You have to live in a place where you have access to trail running. Off-trail running is the absolute coolest thing, but once again, you have to live in a place where you could have access to off-trail running. Obstacle coursing is all of Herbertism. It involves both chasing and escaping, and most modern sport is some version of chasing and escaping. Let's talk more about this topic because we can make a ton of videos on this. Let's have the viewers here direct the conversation into which way we would like this to go. I know how I want to talk about it, but the most important thing is what you guys want to know.